I never imagined the person sleeping in the room next to mine, my entire childhood, would be the one to destroy my life out of pure envy. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 38 years old, an architect in Portland, Oregon, and for 3 decades, I believed my younger brother Derek was my best friend. I was wrong, completely wrong. And when I finally discovered the truth, I realized that every achievement of mine, every moment of happiness, every victory I celebrated was like a knife plunging into his chest. Not out of sadness, but out of a jealousy so deep and sickening that he dedicated years of his life to sabotaging me in every way possible. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story will show you how jealousy can turn your own flesh and blood into your worst enemy. It all started subtly, so subtly that I didn't even notice for years. We grew up in a middle-class family here in Portland, our parents working hard to give us a decent life. I was 3 years older than Derek, and I was always the kind of kid who just naturally stood out. I'm not saying that to brag, it's just a fact. I got good grades without much effort, was popular at school, played on the varsity basketball team. Derek was different. He had to study twice as hard just to get average grades, was shyer and struggled to make friends. And I, like a complete idiot, never saw the resentment building inside him with every compliment our parents gave me, every trophy I brought home, every time someone called me the Thompson prodigy. When I left for college, I went to the University of Washington to study architecture. Derek stayed in Portland, attending a community college for business. I graduated with honors, landed an internship at one of Seattle's top architecture firms, and 3 years later, I was earning 6 figures. It took Derek 6 years to finish his degree, bouncing from job to job, never quite settling down. Our parents worried about him, but I always defended my brother. I called him every week, offered help, sent money when he needed it. I thought I was being a good brother. In reality, I was feeding a monster of resentment that grew with every kind gesture I showed. At 32, I met Sarah. She was beautiful, intelligent, a corporate lawyer at a respected firm in Portland. We fell in love quickly, got engaged within a year, and had a beautiful wedding on the Oregon coast that cost nearly $45,000. Derek was my best man. He gave this incredibly moving speech at the wedding, talking about how I'd always been his hero, how he admired everything I'd accomplished, and how happy he was to see me find true love. Everyone cried. I cried. Now I want to vomit just thinking about that speech, because every single word was a poisoned lie, coming from the mouth of someone who was already plotting to destroy everything I had. 2 years after we got married, Sarah and I bought an incredible house in the West Hills, a highly valued neighborhood in Portland. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a view of Mount Hood for $890,000. It was the pinnacle of my career. I had just become a junior partner at my firm, and my salary had jumped to $240,000 a year. We threw a housewarming party, inviting all our family and friends. Derek showed up with a $15 bottle of wine from Trader Joe's, and that smile I now recognize as pure insincerity. He hugged Sarah for way too long, gushed over the house, and when he hugged me, he whispered in my ear that I deserved all of it. At that moment I felt a chill, but I just brushed it off. What an idiot I was. At the time, Derek was living in a small apartment in Gresham, working as an assistant manager at a Best Buy. He was making maybe $42,000 a year, single, and without many prospects. Our parents were getting more and more worried, and my mother kept asking me to help my brother. So I did what I thought was right. I got him an interview in the administrative department of my firm. It wasn't glamorous, just a project coordination job, but it paid $68,000 a year, had benefits, a 401k, the whole package. He got the job, and I felt good about myself. I had helped my brother. I had been generous. I had brought the snake into my own house. The first 6 months with Derek at the firm were fine. He seemed to be doing well, showing up on time, doing his work, and being polite to everyone. Around that time, Sarah and I started trying to have children. We went through difficult months, with several failed attempts, and Derek was always there to support me. He'd come to the house, bring food, and talk with Sarah when she was emotionally devastated after each negative pregnancy test. I thought my brother had finally matured, that our relationship had evolved into something deeper. I trusted him completely. I let him into my house when I wasn't there. I gave him the Wi-Fi password, the security system code. He had access to everything, and I suspected absolutely nothing. It was Sarah who first started noticing strange things, little things disappearing from the house. A Mont Blanc pen I'd received from a major client, a pair of silver cufflinks that had belonged to my grandfather, an Omega watch I'd bought myself to celebrate my promotion. Sarah would ask if I'd seen these things, and I always just assumed I'd misplaced them, left them at the office, forgotten them somewhere. It never once crossed my mind that someone was stealing them, much less that someone was my own brother. Then, the problems at work began. Projects I was leading started to have strange errors. The wrong specifications were being sent to clients. Deadlines were missed because of miscommunications. Budgets were being blown by duplicate material orders. At first, they were small, fixable things, but they began to pile up. My boss, Richard, the man who had promoted me and trusted me, started questioning me. He'd call me into his office to ask what was going on, why my performance had suddenly dropped. I had no answers. I was working as hard as ever, paying attention to every detail, but the errors just kept appearing. It was like someone was purposefully sabotaging my work, and someone was. Sarah started to grow distant. She'd come home from work tired and stressed, and when I tried to talk, her mind always seemed somewhere else. Our marriage, which had been so solid, began to crack. We'd argue over trivial things, go for days without really speaking, and sleep on opposite sides of the bed. I chalked it all up to the stress of trying to get pregnant, problems at work, the pressures of adult life. I never imagined that Derek was whispering poison in her ear, showing up at the house when I wasn't there, offering a shoulder to cry on, planting seeds of doubt about me, our marriage, everything. One day, I came home early from work because a meeting got cancelled. I saw Derek's car parked in front of my house. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. He was supposed to be at work. I felt this strange knot in my stomach. I slipped through the front door quietly and heard voices coming from the kitchen, Derek and Sarah, laughing. I walked over and found them drinking coffee, sitting very close at the kitchen island. When they saw me, they both jumped like they'd been caught doing something wrong. Sarah said Derek just stopped by to drop off some work documents. Derek confirmed it, showed me a folder, gave me a quick hug, and left. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Triumph, that was it. He looked triumphant. That night I confronted Sarah. I asked her why Derek was at our house in the middle of the afternoon. She got defensive, saying I was being paranoid, that Derek was my brother and was just being kind, supporting her through a difficult time. We had a huge argument. She ended up sleeping in the guest room, and I lay awake all night, one thought pounding in my head. My brother was at my house, alone with my wife, in the middle of the afternoon. And they had both acted like they were hiding something. At that moment, a horrible suspicion began to grow inside me, a suspicion I didn't want to believe, but one that in the coming months would prove to be not only true, but far, far worse than I could ever have imagined. I decided I had to find out what was going on. The very next day, I installed discreet security cameras inside the house, 3 of them. 1 in the living room, 1 in the kitchen, and 1 in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't tell anyone. And I started to watch. I started paying attention. I started investigating my own brother. And what I discovered over the next few weeks completely shattered my image of him, my family, and everything I thought was true. The truth was about to explode in my face, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The first week of filming was uneventful. Sarah would come home from work, change clothes, and cook dinner for when I arrived late. Derek didn't show up once. I started to feel guilty, like I was spying on my own home, on my own wife. Maybe I really was just paranoid. Maybe the stress of work and the pressure of trying for a baby were just driving me crazy. But something in the back of my mind told me to keep watching. A small but persistent voice insisted that something was wrong. So I kept the cameras running. And on Thursday of the second week, at 2:15 p.m., Derek showed up. I was in the office, in a meeting with an important client, when I got the notification on my phone. Motion detected on the living room camera. My heart started racing. I discreetly opened the app under the conference table and saw Derek coming through the front door. He had a key. I had never given him a key. He walked in like he owned the place, went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a beer. My beer. An expensive IPA I'd bought at Whole Foods that weekend. He sat on my couch, put his feet up on my coffee table, and just sat there, drinking, waiting. Waiting for what? My meeting lasted another 40 minutes, and during that entire time, I could barely concentrate, checking my phone every chance I got. At 3 o'clock, Sarah arrived. She never came home this early. Her workday usually went until 6. But there she was, walking through the door, and her reaction when she saw Derek chilled me to the bone. She wasn't surprised. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She smiled. That smile I knew so well, the one she used to give me when we were just starting to date. And Derek stood up, walked over to her and hugged her. It wasn't a brother-in-law hug. It was long, intimate, with his hands lingering dangerously low on her back. I felt my stomach churn. The meeting continued around me, the client talking about deadlines and budgets, and all I could do was stare at the tiny screen of my phone, watching my wife and my brother in an embrace that lasted far too long. They parted ways and went to the kitchen. Sarah grabbed a glass of wine, Derek grabbed another beer. They talked, laughed, and from their body language, anyone could tell there was more to it than friendship. The way Sarah touched his arm when she laughed, the way Derek looked at her, the way he leaned in close when he spoke. I watched for 20 minutes until I couldn't take it anymore. I made up an excuse, told the client I had a family emergency, and left the office like a madman. I drove from downtown Portland to West Hills in 15 minutes, a drive that normally took 30. I broke every speed limit. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I got home, Derek's car was gone. I walked in the door and found Sarah in the living room, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely calm. She looked up when she saw me, surprised. She asked what I was doing home so early. I could have confronted her right then and there. I could have thrown everything in her face. But something held me back. I needed more proof. I needed to know exactly what was going on before I acted, so I lied. I said the meeting had been cancelled, that I was feeling sick, that I was going to lie down for a while. She said okay, that she'd make dinner later, and then she went back to her phone, as if nothing had happened. As if my brother hadn't been at my house 20 minutes ago, hugging her in a way that made my blood boil. I went to my room, locked the door, and watched the footage again. This time paying close attention to every detail. After I'd hurriedly shut down the app in the office, they'd continued in the kitchen for another 15 minutes. And then something happened that shattered my world. Derek pulled Sarah close and kissed her. It wasn't an innocent goodbye kiss on the cheek. It was a real, deep, longing kiss. And Sarah kissed back. My wife, the woman I'd married 4 years ago, the woman I'd been trying to have a baby with, was kissing my brother in my kitchen. They stayed like that for almost a minute before breaking apart. Derek said something I couldn't hear over the camera. Sarah laughed, and he left. She stood there, hand on her chest, smiling. I lay in that bed for 2 hours, trying to process what I'd seen. My marriage was over, that much was obvious. But my brother's betrayal stung in a way I hadn't known possible. It wasn't just that he was having an affair with Sarah. It was that he'd planned it. He'd infiltrated my life, my work, my home, with the sole purpose of destroying everything. And it was working. My work performance was slipping, my marriage was in ruins, and I was there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. For a moment I considered going downstairs and confronting Sarah, throwing it all in her face, throwing her out of the house, calling Derek and breaking up with him. But then I realized something important. If I acted now, in anger, without planning, without more proof, I would be the villain of the story. So I started planning. I continued acting normally, as if nothing had happened. I went down to dinner, talked to Sarah about her day, about work, about trivial things. She lied through her teeth. She said she'd spent the whole day at the office, that it had been tiring, that she was exhausted. Every word was a lie, and she said it with such ease that it made me wonder how many other times she'd lied before. How many other afternoons had Derek come over? How long had this been going on? How many times had they met while I was working, sweating to pay off that nearly $1 million house, to give her the comfortable life she had? Over the next few days, I established a routine. I woke up and went to work, but always with the camera app open on my phone. Derek showed up twice more that week, always at the same time, always with Sarah arriving shortly after. And each time they kissed, talked, and acted like a couple. On Friday, they went further. Derek pulled Sarah to the couch and started kissing her neck. And I turned off my phone before I could see more. Not because I didn't want proof, but because if I saw my brother having sex with my wife on my couch, I would completely lose control. And I couldn't lose control. Not yet. I needed to be strategic. I needed to figure everything out before I acted. I began to dig deeper. I checked Sarah's credit card statements. I found charges from restaurants during times she should have been working. Hotels in downtown Portland. A $340 charge from the Hotel Lucia. Another $280 from the Kimpton Hotel. She was spending my money to meet my brother at hotels. The anger I felt was so intense that my hands shook when I held those statements. But I kept digging. I hacked into her computer while she was in the shower. I found emails, dozens of them, messages between her and Derek dating back 8 months. 8 months. This had started shortly after he got the job I got him. The messages were explicit, romantic, and absolutely devastating. Derek said he'd always wanted Sarah, ever since the day he first saw me with her. Sarah said she felt trapped in a passionless marriage, that I was a good man, but that I didn't make her feel alive the way Derek did. They talked about me as if I were an obstacle, a problem to be solved. In one message, Derek wrote that he was working on a plan to make me lose my job, so I would become financially dependent and Sarah could file for divorce without losing too much in the division of assets. He was intentionally sabotaging my work. The mistakes, the problems with clients, it was all his doing. In another message, Sarah mentioned that she was secretly taking birth control pills. During all those months, we were trying to get pregnant. All those negative pregnancy tests that left her crying in my arms, she was secretly taking birth control. She never wanted to have a child with me. It had all been a sham. The tears, the despair, the sadness, all lies, and Derek knew it. He laughed about it in the messages. He told me I was an idiot for believing her, that I deserved to suffer for always being the favorite son, the successful brother, the one who had everything while he had nothing. I printed out all the emails. I saved all the camera recordings. I took photos of the credit card statements. I organized everything into a physical folder and a digital folder. I created backups. I sent copies to my personal email, to a flash drive I hid in my office, to the cloud. I was going to need all of it, because what I was planning went far beyond a simple divorce. I was going to expose them both. I was going to destroy their reputations. I was going to make everyone know who Derek really was, who Sarah really was, and I was going to make them pay in a way they would never forget. My brother's envy had created a monster inside me, a monster thirsty for justice, and that monster was just beginning to awaken. I discovered the betrayal was even deeper than I imagined when I finally worked up the courage to check the bank accounts. It was a Saturday morning. Sarah had left for what she said was a yoga class, and I was sitting in my home office, all the passwords and documents spread out in front of me. I started with the joint account, the one we used for household expenses, groceries and bills. But that was just the beginning. I logged into my personal account, the one where I received my salary and kept my savings. We had almost $340,000 saved there. It was our fund for when we had children, for emergencies, for the future. Or at least that's what it should have been. When I updated the balance, I nearly fell off my chair. There was only $180,000. $160,000 were gone. I accessed the transaction history, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I found transfers. 12 of them, spanning 5 months, each for different amounts so as not to arouse suspicion. The smallest was $8,000, the largest was $22,000. All to an account I didn't recognize. I got the account number and called the bank immediately. The bank manager, a man named Paul, who had known me for years, was visibly uncomfortable when I asked for information about the transfers. He said he couldn't give details about the destination account for privacy reasons, but he confirmed that all the transfers had been authorized with my online login credentials. Someone had my password. Someone was accessing my account and transferring my money. It didn't take a genius to figure out who. Sarah had access to my computer, knew my passwords, and had my complete trust. She had stolen $160,000 from me. No. They had, because I was absolutely certain that that money was going straight to Derek's hands. I asked Paul to immediately block any future transfers and change all my passwords. He did so immediately and told me to consider filing a police report. He said this was clearly a case of fraud, even if it was committed by someone close to me. I thanked him and hung up. Fraud, theft, marital infidelity, professional sabotage. The list of crimes my brother and wife were committing against me grew by the day, and I hadn't even begun to dig deeper. I was sure there was more. There was always more when it came to people as rotten as they had revealed themselves to be. I decided to hire a private investigator. I found one online, a former Portland police officer named Frank Hutchins, who had excellent reviews and specialized in marital infidelity cases and corporate investigations. I arranged a meeting with him at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, where no one would know me. Frank was a man of about 55, with gray hair and the experienced look of someone who had seen it all. I told him the whole story. I showed him photos of the emails, some excerpts from the camera footage, the bank statements. He listened silently, taking notes, and when I finished, he whistled softly and said this was one of the most elaborate cases of infidelity he had ever seen. Frank told me he needed 2 weeks to conduct a thorough investigation. He would follow Derek, investigate his finances, find out if there were other things I didn't know. He would also check on Sarah, see if there were other people involved, other secrets. He charged $5,000 up front, and I paid in cash, from a separate account I'd opened just for this purpose. I couldn't leave any traces. Sarah couldn't know I was investigating. Derek couldn't suspect anything. I needed them to remain secure, confident that I was the duped idiot they thought I was. And while they relaxed, I was building a case against them that would be absolutely devastating. For those 2 weeks, I had to act. I had to pretend I still loved Sarah, that I still trusted her, that our marriage was just going through a rough patch. I made love to her when she showed interest, always wondering if she thought about Derek during the act. We ate dinner together, watched Netflix on the couch, talked about the future. A future I knew didn't exist. She was good at pretending, but I was getting better. Every fake kiss, every lying, "I love you," every plan for the future she suggested knowing she was cheating on me, all of it only fueled my determination to completely destroy her life when the time came. At work, Derek continued his sabotage. More mistakes began to appear. A major client nearly cancelled a $2 million contract because of faulty specifications that had somehow been submitted with my digital signature. I managed to salvage the contract at the last minute, but Richard, my boss, called me into his office for a serious talk. He said he was concerned about my performance, that I might be overwhelmed, that I might need some time off. I could see the disappointment in his eyes. This man had hired me straight out of college, promoted me, believed in me. And now he was questioning my competence because of my own brother's lies and sabotage. I had to bite my tongue to keep from telling Richard everything right then and there, but I couldn't. I still didn't have enough evidence to directly link Derek to the mistakes. Everything he did was subtle, clever, and hard to trace. He had access to the systems, knew the protocols, and knew exactly how to harm me without leaving obvious evidence. But I knew Frank would find something. I had to. Because if Derek managed to get me to lose my job, as he planned in the emails, I would lose everything. My income, my reputation in the industry, my ability to fight for my rights in the divorce that would inevitably come. It was a perfect plan, and it had almost worked. In the second week of the investigation, Frank called me. He said he'd found some interesting information and that we needed to meet in person. We met at the same coffee shop, and when he opened the folder in front of me, my stomach dropped. Derek had opened a bank account 3 months earlier at a different bank than he normally used. Frank showed me pictures of the apartment, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, river views, a gym in the building, all that ostentation Derek could never afford on his salary. But he could afford it with my money. He'd bought an apartment with the money he'd stolen from me. The audacity was impressive, and there was more. Frank had followed Derek and Sarah on several dates. They didn't just go to hotels. They went to expensive restaurants, the kind that charged $200 per person. They went on a trip to the coast together, stayed at a resort in Cannon Beach that cost $500 a night, all paid for with my money. They were living a life of luxury at my expense, laughing at me, using me as a human ATM. But the most devastating discovery was at the end of Frank's report. He had gained access to text messages between Derek and someone else, our father. Yes, my own father knew about the affair. There were messages from 3 months ago where Derek told Dad about Sarah, about how they had fallen in love, about how he had finally found happiness. And my father, the man who raised me, who always told me to take care of my younger brother, responded by saying he understood that Derek deserved to be happy, that he had always lived in my shadow, and that it was time for him to have something of his own. My father was on Derek's side. He knew he was destroying my marriage, stealing my money, sabotaging my career, and he supported it all. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't just my brother and my wife. It was my own family. My father had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. I asked Frank if my mother knew too. He said he hadn't found any evidence of it, that apparently my father was keeping it a secret from her. At least that. At least my mother, the woman who gave birth to me, who raised me, wasn't involved in this monumental betrayal. But my father was. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to my basketball games, who cried at my wedding, was actively conspiring against me with my brother. Frank told me he had enough evidence for a solid legal case. Fraud, embezzlement, marital infidelity, which in Oregon could affect the division of assets in a divorce. I had everything I needed to legally destroy Derek and Sarah. But legally wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted everyone to know. I wanted every friend, every family member, every co-worker to know exactly what kind of people they were. I wanted public humiliation. I wanted shame. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the pain I was feeling, and I knew exactly how to do it. I began planning my revenge. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be simple, but it would be absolutely devastating. And when it was finished, Derek would finally understand that envy doesn't pay, that destroying someone's life has consequences, and that messing with the wrong person can cost everything. My plan began to take shape one sleepless night, lying next to Sarah as she slept peacefully, probably dreaming of my brother. I wasn't just going to expose their betrayal. I was going to do it in a way that would have the maximum impact at the most devastating moment in front of the right people. I grabbed my laptop and headed to the office. It was 3 in the morning, and I had work to do. First, I needed to protect my assets. I called my personal attorney, a guy named Tom Bradley, who had helped me with the house purchase contracts. I scheduled an urgent meeting for the next day, telling him it was about estate planning. Tom didn't need to know yet about the upcoming divorce. In the meeting with Tom, I got straight to the point. I explained that I had discovered financial irregularities and needed to protect my assets immediately. I showed him the evidence of the unauthorized transfers, the bank statements, everything. Tom was shocked, but like a good lawyer, he quickly sprang into action. He said we needed to do several things immediately. First, open new bank accounts in my name only, transfer all remaining funds there, and document everything meticulously. Second, begin the process of tracing the stolen money to try to recover it legally. Third, start preparing the divorce papers, but don't file them yet. I was going to choose the perfect moment for that. Tom also suggested I hire a family law attorney, someone aggressive and unafraid to fight dirty when necessary. He referred me to a woman named Rebecca Chen, known in Portland for her ruthlessness in divorce cases. Rebecca had a reputation for destroying cheating spouses in court and securing extremely favorable settlements for her clients. She was exactly the kind of person I needed on my side. I scheduled a meeting with her for the following week, and Tom said he would begin working on protecting my assets immediately. I left that office feeling, for the first time in weeks, in control. Meanwhile, at home and at work, I continued my act of being a deceived and oblivious man. Sarah commented that I seemed lighter, happier. She said she was glad to see me like this, that maybe we were finally over our rough patch. The irony was so absurd that I almost laughed in her face. I was happy because I was plotting the complete destruction of her life, and she thought it was because our marriage was improving. Derek noticed the change too. He invited me for a beer after work, something we hadn't done in months. I accepted. I wanted to look into my brother's eyes, see if I could detect any remorse, any sign of humanity. I found nothing but falsehood. We sat at a bar downtown, a place called Deschutes Brewery, and Derek started the conversation by asking how things were at home. He said Sarah had mentioned to him that I seemed stressed, overwhelmed. I had to control my anger when I heard them talking about me, analyzing my emotional state, probably laughing at my ignorance. I replied that everything was fine, just a busy time at work. He agreed, said he'd noticed I was facing some challenges at the firm, and offered to help. The audacity of this son of a bitch to offer help when he was the one responsible for my problems was stomach-churning. But I smiled, thanked him, and said I could figure it out myself. Derek then started talking about himself. He said things were finally looking up for him, that he'd managed to save money, that he was thinking about buying a condo. He was testing the waters, wanting to see my reaction. I feigned happiness for him, asked for details, and he described exactly the loft in the Pearl District that I already knew he'd bought with my money. He said he'd made a good down payment, that the real estate market was favorable, all that bullshit. I smiled and nodded, while inside I imagined what his face would look like when he found out I knew everything, that every word out of his mouth was a lie I'd already exposed. At the end of the night, Derek did something that surprised me. He hugged me, one of those tight brotherly hugs, and told me he loved me, that I would always be his big brother, his hero. He said he knew it hadn't been easy for him growing up in my shadow, but that he admired me, that he wanted to be like me one day. They were beautiful words, even moving, and they were all completely empty, because while he was saying these things, he was sleeping with my wife, stealing my money, sabotaging my career, and conspiring with our father to destroy me. That hug was the moment any remaining brotherly love I had left died completely. Derek was no longer my brother. He was just an enemy who needed to be eliminated. The meeting with Rebecca Chen was eye-opening. She was an Asian American woman in her 40s, with short black hair, an impeccable suit, and a gaze that seemed to see straight into your soul. She listened to my story for 40 minutes without interrupting me once. She looked at all the evidence Frank had collected, the emails, the recordings, the bank statements. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, clasped her hands, and said this was the most solid case of marital infidelity and embezzlement she'd seen in years. She said we could not only secure a divorce on extremely favorable terms, but also prosecute both Sarah and Derek for theft. Rebecca explained the strategy. First, ensure all my assets were protected and documented. Second, build a solid criminal case against both of us for embezzlement and fraud. Third, at the right time, file divorce papers and simultaneously notify Sarah's law firm of her unethical conduct, since using privileged marital information to commit fraud could result in disciplinary action by the Bar Association. Fourth, and this particularly pleased me, expose everything publicly in a way that would completely destroy both of our reputations. Rebecca had contacts at some local Portland gossip blogs who would love a juicy story like this, but I had a better idea for the public outing. In 3 months, it would be Thanksgiving. My mother always hosted a big dinner with the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, close friends. Usually, there were about 30 people. Derek always went. Sarah always went. My father would obviously be there. It would be the perfect gathering. I would wait until that day. I would let everyone gather, eat, laugh, celebrate family and gratitude. And then, at dessert time, when everyone was relaxed and happy, I would drop the bombshell. I would show the evidence, tell everything, expose Derek, Sarah, and my father in front of the whole family. It would be devastating. It would be humiliating. It would be perfect. Rebecca loved the idea, but warned it was risky. 3 months was too long. Too much could happen. Sarah and Derek might discover I knew. They might abscond with more money. They might protect themselves legally. But I was willing to take the risk, because cold, calculated revenge, executed at the perfect moment, was far more satisfying than hasty, emotional revenge. I would spend the next 3 months gathering even more evidence, protecting my assets, and setting the stage for the greatest public humiliation Derek and Sarah could imagine. And in the meantime, I would continue pretending, acting, being the faithful husband and trusting brother they believed me to be. Over the next few weeks, I intensified my evidence collection. I installed a keylogger on Sarah's laptop, recording every keystroke, every password, every message. I hired Frank to continue following Derek and documenting every encounter, every place he went, every penny he spent. I reviewed every financial document, every contract, every paperwork related to our marriage and our properties. I spoke with Tom and Rebecca weekly, refining the strategy, preparing the processes, ensuring that when I finally acted, it would be a blow from which they would never fully recover. Sarah, completely oblivious, began planning our Christmas trip. She wanted to go to Maui, stay at a luxury resort, and spend about $10,000 on a week-long romantic vacation to rekindle our marriage. I agreed to everything, knowing that trip would never happen. By December, she would no longer be my wife. She would be my ex-wife, possibly facing criminal charges, certainly unemployed, and definitely socially and professionally destroyed. Derek was also making plans. He mentioned that he was having a housewarming party at his new apartment in January, and that he wanted me to come to help him celebrate this milestone. I smiled and said I wouldn't miss it for the world, because I truly was not going to miss the opportunity to be there when he found out that the apartment was going to be taken from him as part of the restitution for the stolen money. At work, I finally identified how Derek was sabotaging me. With the help of the IT department, which I persuaded to conduct a security audit, claiming they suspected an external breach, we discovered that someone was accessing my user profile outside of business hours. The accesses were coming from Derek's computer. He was using my credentials, which he had somehow obtained, to log into the systems and make the changes that were damaging to me. I brought this information to Richard, along with the entire access history. Richard was furious. He wanted to confront Derek immediately, fire him, possibly even sue him. But I asked Richard to wait. I explained, without going into too much personal detail, that there was a bigger picture going on, that Derek was involved in other illegal activities, and that I was building a bigger case against him. I simply asked Richard to document everything, save the evidence, and wait. I told him that in a few months everything would be resolved once and for all. Richard, though reluctantly, agreed. He trusted me and understood that sometimes justice needs to be strategic to be effective, but he made it clear that Derek would be fired as soon as I gave the green light, and that the firm would consider legal action against him for the sabotage. The pieces were all falling into place. The cases were prepared, the evidence accumulated, the witnesses lined up, the stage set. Thanksgiving was just 6 weeks away. 6 weeks until the day I would finally show my jealous brother who I really was. Not the naive idiot he thought he could manipulate and destroy, but someone who, when pushed against the wall, fought back with a ferocity he never imagined possible. Revenge was at hand, and it would be glorious. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, something unexpected happened that nearly destroyed all my plans. I came home from work and found Sarah in the kitchen crying. They weren't fake crocodile tears like the ones she shed when she pretended to be sad about negative pregnancy tests. They were real, desperate tears, the kind that come from genuine fear. My first instinct was to ignore her, to let her grieve, but curiosity got the better of me. I asked what had happened. She looked at me with those red, puffy eyes and said she was pregnant. My world stopped for a second. Pregnant. After all those months of pretending to try, secretly taking birth control, she was actually pregnant. My first question, which I thankfully managed to keep from my throat, was whose child it was, but I maintained my composure. I feigned shock, happiness, excitement. I hugged Sarah and asked if she was sure when she'd found out. She said she'd taken 3 tests that afternoon, all positive. She was about 6 weeks along. She said she didn't understand how it had happened since she'd been so careful. And then it hit me. She'd stopped taking the pills. She'd probably decided with Derek that it was time to have a child, but she wanted me to think it was mine. It was the perfect plan. Get pregnant with my brother, make me believe it was my child, and then file for divorce a few years later, securing child support and joint custody of a child who wouldn't even be mine. I stayed awake that entire night, mentally rethinking all my plans. Pregnancy changed everything. Oregon's laws regarding divorce during pregnancy were complicated. Plus, if she really was pregnant with Derek, that added a whole new layer of betrayal. I needed to know for sure whose baby this was. The next morning I called Frank. I explained the situation and asked if there was any way to determine paternity without Sarah knowing. Frank said it was complicated, but not impossible. There were ways to discreetly collect DNA, but we would need to wait until she was further along in the pregnancy to do a non-invasive prenatal test. That would take a few more weeks, perhaps until after Thanksgiving. I couldn't wait that long without knowing, so I came up with another plan. I called Sarah at lunchtime and told her I was so happy with the news that I had scheduled an appointment with the best obstetrician in Portland. A doctor named Dr. Morrison, who practiced at a very expensive private hospital. She said she wanted to ensure she and the baby received the best possible care. Sarah was thrilled and said I was the best husband in the world. If she had known I was doing this solely to gain access to medical tests that could reveal the truth, she might not have been so grateful. I scheduled the appointment for the following week and informed Dr. Morrison through my lawyer Tom of the delicate situation and the possible need for confidential paternity testing. Dr. Morrison, whom Tom knew personally from social events, understood the situation and agreed to help. During the first appointment, he performed all the routine exams and drew Sarah's blood for standard prenatal testing. But he also collected extra samples that would be used later in the pregnancy for a non-invasive paternity test. This test would compare the fetal DNA circulating in Sarah's blood with my DNA and could determine with 99.9% certainty that I was the father. Dr. Morrison said we would need to wait until she was at least 9 or 10 weeks pregnant for the test to be reliable. This meant another 3 or 4 weeks of uncertainty. While I waited for the results, the dynamic at home changed completely. Sarah was beaming, talking about baby names, room decor, all those things pregnant couples talk about. And I had to join in, feign enthusiasm, buy parenting books, go to baby stores. It was psychological torture. Every time she placed my hand on her belly, still flat but soon to be growing, I wondered if I was touching my brother's child. Every time she smiled at me and said how happy she was that we were finally starting our family, I had to suppress the urge to scream the truth in her face. But I stood my ground. Revenge required patience, and I had learned to be very, very patient. Derek reacted strangely when Sarah told him about the pregnancy. I know because I was monitoring their messages through a keylogger. He panicked. He texted her several times asking if she was sure it was his, if I could be the father, what they were going to do. Sarah replied that she was absolutely certain it was his, that she and I had barely had sex in the last few months, that she had stopped taking the pill only during the cycle she got pregnant and had made sure she was with Derek during her fertile period. She said the plan was to make me believe the baby was mine, to trap me even more in the marriage, and then, when the child was born, to file for divorce and guarantee generous alimony for at least 18 years. It was a diabolical, well-thought-out plan, and it might have worked if I were truly the idiot they thought I was. But I had read those messages. I had all the evidence saved in multiple places, and when the paternity test confirmed the baby wasn't mine, I would have the ultimate weapon to destroy them both, not only socially and financially, but also legally. Paternity fraud is a crime in many states, and even if Oregon didn't have specific laws regarding it, it would certainly drastically affect any divorce settlement in my favor. Rebecca, my lawyer, was already salivating at the possibilities when I told her about the pregnancy. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks away when I finally got the call from Dr. Morrison. The paternity test results had arrived. I drove to his office in a state of anxiety I hadn't felt in years. He welcomed me into his private office, closed the door, and opened a sealed envelope. He stared at the papers for a few seconds before looking up at me. The results were conclusive. Probability of paternity 0.0%. I was not the father. The baby growing inside my wife wasn't mine. It was my brother's. The confirmation of what I already suspected was like being shot in the chest. Even knowing, even expecting those results, the reality of the words printed on that paper destroyed me inside. Dr. Morrison gave me a few minutes to process the information. He offered me water, asked if I was okay, and if I needed anything. I thanked him and asked for copies of the results, all duly notarized and signed. He provided everything, put it in an envelope, and shook my hand, saying he was sorry for what I was going through. I left that office on autopilot. I got in my car, drove to an empty parking lot near the Willamette River, and for the first time since all this shit had begun, I cried. I cried for my destroyed life, for my ruined marriage, for the family I thought I would have and now never would. I cried for the utter betrayal of people I loved. And then I dried my tears, took a deep breath, and transformed that pain into cold, calculated determination. I called Rebecca and set up an emergency meeting. I showed her the paternity test results and she was shocked. Even though she'd seen a lot in her career, she said this was a complete game changer. It wasn't just infidelity and embezzlement anymore. It was paternity fraud, an attempt to make me assume financial and emotional responsibility for a child that wasn't mine. The Oregon courts wouldn't look kindly on that. Rebecca said we could use this not only in the divorce, but also in a separate criminal case against Sarah and Derek. The child support she expected to receive, forget it. The 50-50 division of assets? No way. I was leaving that marriage with everything, and she was leaving with nothing but a baby and a cheating brother, who probably wouldn't have the money to support them after returning everything he stole from me. Rebecca suggested that perhaps we should move up the exposure, not wait until Thanksgiving. But I refused. It was only 2 weeks away. I'd waited months. I could wait another 2 weeks. And the impact of exposing everything in front of the family, especially considering my mother knew nothing, would be far greater than doing it in private. I wanted my mother to see for herself what kind of son she'd raised in Derek. I wanted her to see what kind of man my father had become by supporting that betrayal. I wanted the entire extended family, all the friends, everyone in that room to know the truth. And then, after Thanksgiving, after the public outburst, would come the legal part, the lawsuits, the hearings, the cold, impersonal justice of the system. I spent the next 2 weeks on autopilot. Sarah noticed I was distant and attributed it to work stress. Derek continued his charade of concerned brother, inviting me to lunch, asking about the pregnancy, feigning happiness for our growing family. My father called a few times, we chatted about trivial things, and he never mentioned anything about knowing about the affair. The hypocrisy was suffocating. But I smiled, waved, and counted the days, counted the hours, counted the minutes, until I would finally lay all my cards on the table and watch their empire of lies crumble completely. On Thanksgiving Eve, I reviewed all the evidence one last time. The printed emails, organized chronologically. The bank statements highlighting each fraudulent transfer, Frank's photos showing Derek and Sarah together in hotels, restaurants, and his apartment. The security camera footage from my home, the messages between Derek and my father. And the paternity test results in a separate envelope, saved for the final moment, the coup de grace. I placed everything in a brown leather folder, along with a flash drive containing digital backups of everything. This folder would be the bomb that would explode in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, destroying lives and exposing truths. And I couldn't wait. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke at 6 in the morning, even though it was a holiday. I hadn't been able to sleep well. My body vibrated with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Sarah was still asleep, one hand on her stomach in a protective gesture that now sickened me. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to remember the last time I'd felt true love for that woman. I couldn't. All the good memories were now tainted, stained by betrayal, poisoned by lies. I got up silently, showered, and got dressed. I put on a blue dress shirt and chinos, wanting to look presentable for the onslaught to come. The brown folder with all the evidence was stored in the trunk of my car, hidden under a blanket. No one would suspect a thing. Sarah woke up around 8, excited about the day. She said she was looking forward to telling the whole family about the pregnancy, that it would be a wonderful surprise for Thanksgiving. I agreed, saying it would truly be unforgettable. She didn't catch the irony in my voice. We prepared some dishes to take to my mother's house, as we always did. Sarah made a pumpkin pie and mashed sweet potatoes with marshmallows on top. I made my famous Caesar salad, not because I felt like cooking, but because I needed to keep up appearances until the last minute. We packed everything in the car, along with the evidence folder Sarah hadn't even known was there, and drove the 20 minutes to my parents' house in Lake Oswego. The house was decorated as always. My mother had that knack for making everything feel cozy and festive. Autumn leaf garlands, cinnamon-scented candles, the huge table set with a linen tablecloth and fine china. A few people had already arrived. My aunt and uncle, some cousins, close family friends. Derek arrived shortly after us, alone as always, carrying a bottle of red wine that had probably cost over $100, bought with my stolen money. He greeted me with a hug, kissed Sarah on the cheek for half a second longer than was appropriate, and walked in as if he owned the place. My father was in the living room watching football, the annual Thanksgiving game between the Cowboys and the Giants. He greeted me without taking his eyes off the TV. My mother was in the kitchen, supervising the turkey that had been in the oven for hours. She hugged me tightly, commented on how thin I was, and asked if I was eating properly. That woman had the gift of being a mother. Even when I was almost 40, I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that what I was about to do would ruin her Thanksgiving, likely ruin her vision of her own family. But she deserved to know the truth. She deserved to know what kind of men her husband and youngest son were, and I deserved justice, even if it meant causing pain to innocent people in the process. Sarah offered to help in the kitchen, and I went into the living room to join the men watching the game. The hours passed with the torturous slowness of someone awaiting execution. More family arrived, and the house filled with voices, laughter, and the smell of cooking. Children ran around the yard, uncles discussed politics and sports, and aunts gossiped about neighbors and acquaintances. It was the perfect scene for a traditional American Thanksgiving. A facade of family harmony was about to be shattered. Derek was particularly animated, cracking jokes, sharing smiles, being the center of attention as he'd always wanted to be. At one point, he put his arm around my shoulders and told our Uncle George that I was the best brother in the world, that he would be nothing without me. People smiled, finding it touching. I smiled too, but inside, I was counting the minutes. Finally, at 4 o'clock, my mother announced that dinner was ready. Everyone gathered around the enormous table that took up the entire dining room. It was a table for 12, but my mother had added extensions and extra chairs to accommodate the 32 people present. I made sure I was seated strategically at the head of the table opposite my father, with a clear view of the entire table. Sarah was to my right, Derek a few seats down, my mother near the kitchen so she could come and go easily. My father, as patriarch, sat at the other head. He offered the traditional prayer of Thanksgiving, giving thanks for his family, his health, and the blessings of the year. The hypocrisy of those words coming from the mouth of a man who had conspired against his own son was almost comical. The food began to circulate. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green beans, baked yams, breads, salads. The table was literally groaning under the weight of all that food. Conversations flowed naturally, people laughing, telling stories, helping themselves generously. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my stomach churning with anticipation. Sarah was beaming, chatting animatedly with my cousin Julie about pregnancy, Julie having had a baby the year before. Derek ate and drank wine, engaging in multiple conversations simultaneously, completely at ease. Neither of us had the slightest idea what was to come, and that made it all the more satisfying. When everyone had finished their main course and was in that comfortable state of satiety that comes after a hearty meal, my mother began bringing out the desserts. Pumpkin pie, pecan pie, apple pie, cheesecake, ice cream. Coffee was being served, and some people were ordering tea. It was the perfect moment, that gap between dinner and dessert where everyone is relaxed, their bellies full, their guards down. I rose from my chair and tapped my glass lightly with a spoon, drawing attention. The chatter faded until everyone was looking at me. Sarah smiled, thinking I was going to make a toast or announce the pregnancy. Derek raised his glass too, ready to toast with me. My mother stopped halfway between the kitchen and the table, holding a pie. This was the moment. I began by talking about tradition, about how Thanksgiving was a time of gratitude, but also of truth. About how that family gathering represented the values our parents had taught us: honesty, loyalty, and brotherly love. A few people nodded in agreement. My Uncle Robert said, "Amen." I continued by saying I had something important to share with everyone, something I'd recently discovered that would forever change our family dynamic. The smile on Sarah's face began to falter. Derek frowned in confusion. My father looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, and then I dropped the bombshell. He said he'd discovered my wife was having an affair with my brother, and that she was pregnant with his child. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. You could have heard a needle drop. All 32 people were frozen, glasses in the air, forks halfway to their mouths, eyes wide with shock. Sarah went white, all the blood draining from her face. Derek dropped his wine glass, which shattered on the floor, red wine spilling like blood onto my mother's beige carpet. My mother dropped the pie, which landed on the table with a thud. My father rose from his chair so quickly it toppled back, and I kept talking, my voice calm, controlled, each word a knife plunging into their hearts. I said I had proof. I knew everything, that they had stolen over $160,000 from me, that Derek had sabotaged my career, that Sarah had pretended to want a child with me while on birth control. Sarah tried to speak, her voice a desperate squeak. She said I was crazy, that I didn't know what I was talking about, that I would never cheat on my husband. Derek stood, his hands shaking, saying it was all a lie, that I was having some kind of nervous breakdown. But I was prepared for the denials. I went to the car, grabbed the brown folder, and returned to the dining room where everyone was still in shock. I opened the folder and began distributing copies of the evidence. The printed emails, showing the explicit conversations between Sarah and Derek about their affair, about how they laughed at me, about their plans to destroy me. The photos of Frank, showing them kissing, checking into hotels together, the apartment Derek bought with my money, the bank statements with the transfers highlighted. My mother picked up a stack of papers with trembling hands. She read the emails, looked at the photos, and began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Derek with an expression of horror and disappointment. My aunts and uncles leafed through the papers, some in disgust, some in anger, all in shock. My cousin Julie hugged her mother, hiding her face. The children, sensing something terrible was happening, even though they didn't understand what, were quiet and frightened. Sarah was now crying uncontrollably, begging me to stop, saying we could work this out in private. But I wouldn't stop. I'd waited months for this moment, and it wasn't over yet. The final blow was yet to come. I picked up the separate envelope, the one with the paternity test results. I said out loud for everyone to hear that Sarah was 6 weeks pregnant, that she had announced the pregnancy as if it were my child, but that I had taken a test, and that the baby wasn't mine. It was Derek's. I opened the envelope and read the results aloud. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. Biological father ruled out. Sarah collapsed in her chair, sobbing so loudly she sounded like a wounded animal. Derek stood there, pale as a ghost, his mouth opening and closing without sound coming out. And then I turned to my father, who had been silent throughout the presentation. I said I had one more revelation, that my own father knew about the affair, that he had supported Derek, encouraged him, conspired with him against me. He distributed copies of the messages between Derek and my father. Messages in which my father said Derek deserved to be happy, that he'd lived in my shadow for too long, that it was time for him to have something I had. My mother read those messages and looked at her husband of over 40 years, as if she were seeing a stranger. She asked, her voice breaking, if it was true, if he'd really known and supported it. My father tried to explain, saying it was more complicated than it seemed, that Derek had always felt inferior, that he just wanted his youngest son to be happy. But his words fell on deaf ears. There was no justification that could explain that level of betrayal. He had chosen one son over the other, and he had chosen wrongly. Thanksgiving had turned into a battlefield. Aunts and uncles yelling, some defending, some attacking. My mother crying inconsolably, Sarah trying to leave the room, but being blocked by my cousin Amanda, who screamed at her, calling her every name in the book. Derek cornered by 3 of my male cousins who seemed ready to resort to physical violence. My father trying to control the situation, but being completely ignored. And I, in the center of all this chaos, felt strangely at peace. Finally, after months of pretense, of silent pain, of meticulous planning, the truth was out, and there was no going back. The masks had fallen, and everyone could see Derek and Sarah for what they truly were. Liars, traitors, thieves. The chaos in the dining room continued for another 20 minutes before things began to calm down even slightly. Sarah had run to the bathroom and locked the door, her sobs audible throughout the house. Derek sat in a chair in the corner, his head in his hands, completely devastated. My father had gone to his office and closed the door, refusing to speak to anyone. My mother was on the living room sofa, being comforted by her sister, my Aunt Patricia, who alternated between hugging my mother and looking at me with a mixture of pity and admiration. The other guests gradually began to leave, some giving me supportive hugs, others simply wanting to escape the uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible. Within half an hour, the house that had been filled with joy and celebration was nearly empty and plunged into a heavy silence. My Uncle Robert, my mother's older brother, and a leading figure in the family, was one of the few who remained. He approached me, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and told me I had done the right thing, that secrets like those were a cancer that needed to be removed, no matter how painful the process. He said he would support me in whatever I needed, that I was still part of the family and always would be. Those words meant more than he could have imagined. Amidst all that destruction, knowing I had at least a few people on my side made a difference. I thanked him, and he left, not before giving a hard look in the direction where Derek sat, a look that said everything about what he thought of my brother now. Sarah finally emerged from the bathroom, her eyes so swollen she could barely open them. She approached me, tried to touch my arm, but I recoiled as if she were poisonous. She began to speak, her voice hoarse and broken, saying she could explain, that things weren't as they seemed, that she loved me. Every word was a pathetic, desperate lie. I cut her off mid-sentence. I told her I didn't want to hear anything she had to say, that everything I needed to know was already in the evidence I'd collected over the past few months. I informed her that the divorce papers would be filed Monday morning, that she had a week to leave my house, and that any attempt at contact would be considered harassment and dealt with legally. I saw the realization hit her, the understanding that there was no going back, no forgiveness, no second chances. Derek rose from his chair and walked over to me, looking as if he'd aged 10 years in an hour. He tried to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. He said my name, Marcus, for the first time sounding genuinely remorseful, But it was too late for repentance, years too late. I told him exactly what I thought, that he'd wasted his entire life envying me instead of building something of his own. That all the generosity I'd shown, all the help I'd offered, he'd thrown in my face in the worst possible way. That he wasn't my brother anymore, just a criminal who'd stolen from me and would face the full legal consequences of his actions. I informed him that on Monday, in addition to the divorce, I'd be filing criminal charges against him and Sarah for embezzlement, fraud, and everything else my lawyers could come up with. Derek's expression changed from regret to panic. He hadn't considered me going this far. He thought there might be a divorce, maybe some family drama, but criminal charges. Potential arrest? A criminal record? That hadn't even crossed his mind. He began to stutter, saying he'd return the money, that he'd do anything, that there was no need to involve the police. But I was adamant. I told him he should have considered the consequences before deciding to destroy my life. That actions have consequences, and his would be severe. My lawyer, Rebecca, already had all the documents prepared, all the evidence organized. On Monday morning, a legal storm would descend on Derek and Sarah that would leave them ruined for years, possibly decades. My mother finally found the strength to speak. She looked at Derek with a mixture of maternal love and profound disappointment. She asked how he could have done that to his own brother, to his own family. Derek had no answer. He just stood there, head down, defeated. My mother then turned to me and asked if there was any way to resolve this without completely destroying the family, without criminal charges, without all that additional public exposure. I understood her request. She was their mother, and even with all the betrayal, she still loved Derek, but I couldn't do that for her, not after everything. I said I was sorry, but that Derek and Sarah had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, that the damage was permanent and irreparable, and that justice needed to be served. Sarah made one last desperate attempt. She placed her hand on her belly and said she was pregnant, that I couldn't do that to her in that state, that the stress could harm the baby. It was emotional manipulation of the worst kind. I coldly replied that she should have thought about the baby before getting pregnant by her lover while she was married to me. That the baby wasn't my responsibility, it was hers and Derek's. And that they would have to figure out how to care for a child without the money they'd stolen from me, because every penny would be recovered through the courts. Sarah literally collapsed to the floor, kneeling on my mother's dining room rug, begging. It was pathetic, and I felt zero pity. Pity was for people who deserved it. She deserved nothing more than what she was getting. Derek helped Sarah up and told her they should leave. It was the first intelligent thing out of his mouth all day. Before they left, he turned to me one last time and said that I had won, that he had lost, that I had always been better than him at everything, and that this had finally been definitively proven. It wasn't quite like that. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about him being so consumed by envy that he had become a monstrous person, capable of betrayal in the most profound way possible. But I let him think what he wanted. He and Sarah walked out the front door, got into her car, and drove away. I never wanted to see either of them again in my life, except in court. My mother hugged me for a long time after they left. She cried on my shoulder, apologizing repeatedly for raising a son capable of this, for not seeing the signs, for failing me as a mother. I had to reassure her that none of this was her fault. Derek had made choices, terrible choices that were solely his responsibility. She had no way of knowing his jealousy would grow to such destructive proportions. No one could have known. He had hidden it well for years, perhaps decades. But now it was exposed and it could never be hidden again. Family knew, friends would soon know. And soon, with the lawsuits to come, it would be a matter of public record. I went to the office where my father had locked himself. I knocked on the door, but he didn't answer. I knocked harder and said we needed to talk, now. Eventually I heard the lock unlock and went in. My father was sitting behind his desk, looking 20 years older. He started to try to explain himself, to justify his actions, but I interrupted him. He said there was no justification, that he had betrayed not only my trust, but the fundamental role of a father, that by choosing to support Derek in that monstrous betrayal, he had lost a son, because I could no longer consider him my father. He tried to argue, saying he still loved me, that Derek had emotional problems and needed support, that he had tried to do what was best for both of his sons, but they were empty excuses, and he knew it. I asked him directly, if he thought Derek needed support so badly, why hadn't he talked to me? Why hadn't he tried family therapy? Why had he chosen the path of conspiracy and secretly encouraging a horrific betrayal? He had no answers. He just sat there staring at his hands. He told me he, too, would face consequences, that I no longer wanted to be with him, that he would not be welcome in my life from then on. I saw the pain in his eyes when he said this, and part of me, a small, distant part, felt pity. But most of me was hard as stone, relentless in the pursuit of justice. He had made choices, and choices have consequences. I left my parents' house that Thanksgiving night with a strange feeling of relief mixed with profound sadness. Relief, because the truth was finally out in the open, because I no longer had to pretend, because the weight of carrying that secret alone had been lifted from my shoulders. But sadness because my family, as I knew it, had ceased to exist. My marriage was over. My relationship with my brother was shattered beyond repair. My relationship with my father was broken. Only my mother remained, and even she was devastated and broken by what she had discovered. I drove home in silence, to the house that would soon be mine alone, free of Sarah and all the lies those walls had witnessed. I got home, and everything was exactly as we'd left it that morning, before I'd left for dinner. Dishes in the sink waiting to be washed. The couch was still made, pillows in place, wedding photos on the walls that would soon be taken down and thrown away. But even though everything seemed normal, the house felt different. It felt lighter. It felt like mine again. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, sat on my couch, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. The revenge had been sweet as I'd imagined, and it wasn't even over yet. The fun part was just beginning, and that part would be even more satisfying, because it would involve not just social humiliation, but real, tangible consequences that Derek and Sarah would carry for the rest of their lives. I called Rebecca, even though it was a holiday. She answered on the third ring, already expecting my call. I told her about Thanksgiving, the exposure, the reactions, everything. She listened silently and then said she had done the right thing, that public exposure in cases like this was therapeutic and necessary. We confirmed that the papers would be filed on Monday as planned. Divorce, criminal charges, all simultaneously. It would be a coordinated attack against which they would have no way to adequately defend themselves. Rebecca said that with the evidence we had, the case was practically won before it even began. All that was left was to execute the plan and watch the pieces fall apart. And I was more than ready for that. The revenge was far from over. In fact, it was just heating up. The weekend after Thanksgiving was surreal. Sarah didn't come home on Friday or Saturday. I received a text from her saying she was staying at a hotel and would send someone to pick up her things during the week. I didn't respond. I spent those 2 days alone in the house, mentally organizing everything that needed to be done, reviewing documents with Tom and Rebecca over the phone, preparing myself psychologically for the legal battle that would begin on Monday. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if I could physically wash away all the betrayal that had happened there. I took all of Sarah's photos off the walls and stored them in boxes in the garage. I removed all traces of her from the master bedroom. It was my home again, mine alone. On Monday morning, I woke up at 5, showered, and dressed in my best suit. I had a series of legal appointments ahead of me, and I wanted to look impeccable. At 7 sharp, I was in Rebecca's office, where I signed all the necessary paperwork. A divorce petition citing infidelity, embezzlement of marital funds, and fraud. A criminal complaint against Derek Thompson and Sarah Mitchell for theft, embezzlement, and wire fraud. A temporary restraining order preventing them both from accessing any of my accounts or properties. Rebecca had worked all weekend, preparing everything, and it was impeccable. Every I dotted, every T crossed. There were no loopholes, no room for maneuver. It was a meticulously planned legal massacre. At 9 in the morning, when the courts opened, Rebecca filed all the paperwork. By noon, Sarah had been officially notified of the divorce by a court official who met her at her hotel. She called me immediately, crying, begging to talk, saying she'd gotten a lawyer and that he'd told me I couldn't do it. I hung up on her. I blocked her number. I had nothing to say to her. Everything that needed to be said was in the legal documents she'd just received. Derek was notified at work in front of his colleagues, which was particularly satisfying. Richard, my boss, called me shortly afterward to confirm that Derek had been escorted out of the building by security and that he was officially fired for cause. The criminal complaints took a bit longer to process. A Portland police detective, a man named James Sullivan, was assigned to the case. He called me on Tuesday to schedule an interview. We met at Portland Central Station, and I spent 3 hours going through all the evidence with him. Frank, my private investigator, was also there, presenting all the documentation he had collected. Detective Sullivan was impressed by the quantity and quality of the evidence. He said he rarely saw such well-documented cases come to his desk. He explained that the process would be lengthy, that they would need to investigate, verify the evidence, and possibly obtain warrants to access bank accounts and electronic records officially. But he said that, based on what he had seen, there was definitely grounds for criminal charges. As the legal process progressed, I began to rebuild my life. First, work. I scheduled a meeting with Richard and explained the entire situation in detail. I showed him the evidence of how Derek had sabotaged me, the unauthorized access to my profile, the malicious changes to documents. Richard was furious, not with me, but with Derek. He said he would sue Derek personally for the damages caused to the firm, that some of the mistakes had nearly cost me millions of dollars in contracts. Most importantly, Richard assured me that my position at the firm was secure, that he completely understood what I had been through, and that he trusted me as he always had. That meant the world to me. At least professionally, I was intact. Socially, things were more complicated. News of what had happened on Thanksgiving spread through my family and circle of friends like wildfire. My phone rang off the hook with calls from distant relatives, friends I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know the details, offer support, or simply satisfy their morbid curiosity. Some mutual friends, Sarah and I, had took sides. Most sided with me after seeing the evidence, but some, especially Sarah's close friends, tried to argue that there were two sides to every story, that perhaps I had been a neglectful husband, that perhaps there were reasons she had sought comfort elsewhere. I cut these people out of my life immediately. I didn't have the time or energy to deal with those who couldn't see betrayal for what it was. My mother was devastated. She called me every day, sometimes crying, sometimes just wanting to hear my voice. She had moved in with her sister temporarily, unable to live in the same house as my father. They weren't officially separated, but she had made it clear she needed space to process everything. My father had tried calling me a few times, but I never answered. Eventually, he stopped trying. Derek also tried to contact me multiple times, including showing up at my work once, but security wouldn't let him up. He sent long emails asking for forgiveness, explaining that jealousy had consumed him, that he had untreated psychological issues, that he needed help, They might be true, but they didn't change anything. His actions had consequences, and apologies didn't erase them. Sarah was more persistent. She hired a divorce lawyer, a woman named Linda Hoffman, who was known for her aggressive nature. Linda tried several tactics. First, she argued that the divorce should be postponed due to Sarah's pregnancy, that she was emotionally vulnerable and needed time. Rebecca destroyed this argument by showing that the pregnancy was the result of infidelity with another man. Then, Linda tried to argue that Sarah was entitled to half the marital assets regardless of the infidelity. Rebecca countered with embezzlement, showing that Sarah had stolen over $160,000 and therefore lost any right to any division of assets. It was a fierce legal battle, but we held all the winning cards. The criminal case was also moving forward. In mid-December, Derek and Sarah were formally indicted for embezzlement and fraud. Both were taken to court and had to hire criminal lawyers, which weren't cheap. Derek had to sell the Pearl District apartment he'd bought with my money to pay for the lawyers. Sarah had to borrow money from her parents, who were apparently horrified when they discovered what their daughter had done. The prosecution was seeking not only full restitution of the stolen money, but also prison time. Derek's lawyer managed to negotiate a plea bargain to avoid jail time in exchange for a full confession and restitution, but the case was still ongoing. In mid-January, 4 weeks after filing the papers, the divorce was finalized. Rebecca had secured an extremely favorable settlement. I kept the house, all the assets, and all the remaining savings. Sarah received nothing, zero. Furthermore, she had to pay $50,000 in compensation for the emotional distress and legal costs I had incurred. The judge presiding over the case, a woman in her 60s named the Honorable Margaret Foster, had looked at Sarah with absolute disgust when she read the evidence. She said that in her 30-year career she had never seen such a calculated and malicious case of marital infidelity. The ruling was a complete victory. Sarah walked out of that courtroom devastated, both financially and emotionally, and I felt no mercy. Derek was facing his own battles. In addition to the criminal charges, Richard and the architectural firm had sued him civilly for damages caused by the sabotage. This lawsuit was seeking $400,000 in damages. Derek had nowhere near that amount. He had been forced into bankruptcy, his credit was destroyed, and he was living in a tiny apartment in Gresham, working a minimum-wage job at a convenience store. The fall had been spectacular. From the guy who had dreamed of having everything I had, he had become someone who had nothing, and it was all his fault. Every decision, every action motivated by envy had led to his own destruction. The criminal case finally reached a conclusion in February. Derek and Sarah accepted plea agreements. Derek confessed to embezzlement and fraud and received a 3-year suspended sentence, meaning he wouldn't go to jail unless he violated his probation, plus 5 years of probation and full restitution of the $167,000 stolen. Sarah received a similar sentence, 2 years suspended, 4 years of probation, and was ordered to pay half the restitution. Both now had criminal records, meaning their professional lives were essentially over. Sarah had been terminated from her law firm and was facing disciplinary proceedings from the Bar Association that would likely result in the suspension of her license. As for the baby, Sarah had a girl in June. I never saw the child, never wanted to. It wasn't my responsibility, it wasn't my family. I'd heard through third parties that Derek was trying to be a present father, but considering he worked a 15-hour job and owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution and civil lawsuits, it was hard to imagine how he could adequately provide for a child. Sarah had moved back in with her parents, who were helping with the baby. Their lives were a complete mess. And while part of me knew an innocent child was suffering the consequences of her parents' actions, most of me simply didn't care. They had made choices, and this child was the result of those choices. My own life was finally beginning to stabilize. The house was truly mine now. I'd completely remodeled it, painted the walls, bought new furniture, and eliminated every trace of Sarah. It was a fresh start. At work, I'd been promoted to full partner, a recognition of both my work and my handling of the entire situation. He was now earning over $300,000 a year, had paid all legal fees, and still had a healthy bank account. Financially, he was better than ever. Emotionally, he was still processing everything, going to therapy weekly, working through the betrayal and rebuilding trust. But he was progressing. He was healing. I was slowly becoming whole again. The revenge had been complete. Derek had lost everything. His job, his reputation, his financial freedom, his professional future. Sarah, too. Both would bear the scars of what they had done for the rest of their lives, and I had emerged not only victorious, but stronger. I had proven to myself that I wasn't the passive victim they thought I was, that when pushed to the limit, I was capable of fighting back with a calculated ferocity that destroyed them completely. Derek's envy had been the seed of his own destruction, and I had been the gardener who ensured that seed grew into a poisonous tree that eventually strangled him. Justice had been served, and it was sweet. The following months brought a strange sense of normalcy. It was as if the storm had finally passed, and I was living in the calm that came after the destruction. I continued my therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Helen Marks, who helped me process not only the betrayal, but also what I had done in response. She never judged my actions, but she made me question whether revenge had truly brought me the peace I had hoped for. It was a question I avoided answering honestly, because the truth was complicated. Yes, it had been satisfying to see Derek and Sarah face consequences, but the satisfaction was hollow in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own family, and all that remained were ruins. My mother and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. She eventually moved back home with my father, but things between them were never the same. She told me they'd started couples therapy, that my father was genuinely sorry, that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. But she also admitted that trust had been broken in a way that might never be fully repaired. As for my father and I, we spent almost a year without speaking. It was my mother who eventually brokered a meeting between us at a neutral cafe. It was uncomfortable, tense, full of long silences and carefully chosen words. My father apologized, saying he'd failed as a father, that he'd let his own frustration with the comparisons between his children cloud his judgment. I accepted the apology, but made it clear that forgiveness would take time. Years, perhaps. He had betrayed not only my trust, but everything I believed a father should represent. We agreed to try to rebuild some kind of relationship, but it would be on my terms, in my time. We started with monthly lunches, superficial conversations about work and the weather, carefully avoiding any mention of Derek or Sarah or what had happened. It was artificial and forced, but it was a start. My mother seemed relieved that we were at least trying. For her, the idea of a family completely destroyed was unbearable, so I would try, not for myself or my father, but for her, because she was the only person in this whole mess who was truly innocent. Derek tried to contact me several times during this period. Long emails, handwritten letters sent to my work address, messages through shared relatives, all saying essentially the same thing. That he was sorry, that he was in therapy, that he understood he had been consumed by envy, that he wanted a chance to redeem himself. I ignored them all. I blocked emails, threw away letters unread, told relatives I didn't want to be a messenger between us. There was no redemption possible for what he had done. Some crimes against family are unforgivable, and his qualified. The idea of ever having any kind of relationship with Derek sickened me. He had killed the brother I thought I knew, and in his place he left a stranger for whom I felt nothing but disdain. Sarah also tried to reach out, albeit less frequently. Through mutual acquaintances, she learned she was struggling. Her daughter, whom she had named Emma, was a difficult child, crying constantly, with health problems that required frequent doctor visits. Sarah couldn't afford proper care, relying entirely on her parents. Her law license had been suspended for 2 years by the State Bar Association, so she was working as a secretary in a small office, earning a fraction of what she had previously earned. Medical bills were piling up. The restitution debt hung over her like a guillotine, and Derek was essentially useless as a provider. The life she had envisioned when she began her affair with Derek, full of passion and freedom, had turned into a nightmare of poverty and regret. Part of me, a very small part, felt something akin to pity when I heard about her struggles. But then I remembered the messages I'd read. The plans they'd made to use and destroy me, the coldness with which she'd pretended to want a child with me while secretly taking pills. And any trace of pity evaporated instantly. Sarah had made choices. She'd chosen to cheat. He'd chosen to steal. I'd chosen to try to trap myself in a lie that would last decades. The consequences of those choices were hers to bear. It wasn't my responsibility to ease the suffering of someone who tried to destroy me. Karma, I discovered, was real, and it was absolutely brutal. At work, things were going incredibly well. The project Derek had nearly completely sabotaged, that $2 million contract with a major client, had not only been saved, but had expanded. The client was so impressed with how I handled the crisis and corrected all the mistakes that he offered the firm an additional $5 million contract for a second project. I was appointed lead architect, and the success of that project solidified my reputation not only at the firm, but in the Portland industry as a whole. I began receiving offers from other firms, invitations to speak at conferences, requests to contribute articles to architectural magazines. My career was blossoming in a way it had never before. I met someone in September, almost a year after the catastrophic Thanksgiving. Her name was Jennifer. She was an interior designer, 32 years old, and we met at an architecture conference in Seattle. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't intense or overwhelming like it had been with Sarah. It was gradual, based on real conversations, shared interests, a genuine connection that grew organically. When I finally told her about what happened with Sarah and Derek, I expected her to run. But Jennifer heard everything, processed it, and then said she admired how I had handled the betrayal. She said it showed strength of character, that many people would have crumbled or reacted violently. That legal revenge, though severe, had been appropriate given the circumstances. Jennifer had no romantic illusions about relationships. She'd been married before, divorced after discovering her ex-husband had a second family in another state. So she understood betrayal in a way most people didn't. We started dating slowly, without pressure, without unrealistic expectations. She never asked to meet my family, understanding how complicated the situation was. When I finally introduced her to my mother months later, the two hit it off immediately. My mother later said she could see Jennifer was different from Sarah, that there was an authenticity to her that Sarah never had. That meant a lot to me, having my mother's approval to move forward. On the second anniversary of the Thanksgiving I exposed, I found myself in a completely different place. I was in a healthy and happy relationship with Jennifer. My career was booming. I was financially stable and prosperous. I had recovered $120,000 of the $167,000 stolen through restitution agreements, and while the rest would likely never be fully recovered, I had made peace with it. My relationship with my mother was strong. With my father, he was cordial, if not warm. And Derek and Sarah were just people who existed somewhere in the same city as me, but might as well have been on another planet, considering how little impact they had on my life now. Dr. Marks asked me in a session if I had any regrets about how I'd handled everything. I thought carefully before answering. Regrets? Maybe for not acting sooner, for trusting blindly for so long. Maybe for exposing everything in front of the entire family, causing collateral pain to innocent people like my mother. But regret for seeking justice, for exposing the truth, for making Derek and Sarah face consequences for their actions? No, not even a little. They had tried to destroy my life out of envy, greed, and pure selfishness, and I had shown them, and everyone who witnessed, that actions have consequences, that betrayal has a price, and that underestimating the wrong person can cost everything. Derek's envy had been the spark that started it all. But it was his own arrogance, the belief that I was too stupid to figure it out, too weak to fight back, too good to seek revenge, that had ensured his complete destruction. He had underestimated me on every possible level, and that mistake had cost him everything. His career, his reputation, his financial freedom, his future. And honestly, he deserved every second of suffering, every penny lost, every opportunity destroyed. Because what he had tried to do to me was equally destructive. It just hadn't worked, because I had been smarter, more patient, more strategic. The difference between us wasn't luck, it was skill. And that skill had made all the difference. I was in my house, the house that was truly mine now, sitting on the porch with Jennifer beside me, drinking wine and watching the sunset over the Portland Hills. She asked what I was thinking. I told her I was thinking about how strange life was, how a person you love can turn out to be a stranger, how intense pain can eventually turn into growth. She squeezed my hand and told me she was proud of who I had become through it all. And I realized I was too. Not proud of the revenge itself, but proud of having survived, of having fought, of having refused to be the passive victim Derek and Sarah expected me to be. I had shown them who I truly was, and that revelation had changed everything. The story was coming to an end, but the lessons would remain forever. Trust is precious and must be given carefully. Family doesn't always mean loyalty, and when someone tries to destroy you out of pure envy, the best revenge isn't to stoop to their level, but to expose the truth and let the natural consequences of their actions do the work. Derek had envied everything I had, and in the process of trying to take what was mine, he had lost everything that was his. It was poetic in a tragic way, and it was finally, after all, truly over. 3 years after that Thanksgiving that changed everything, I received an unexpected call. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. On the other end, a female voice that took a few seconds to identify. It was Linda Hoffman, the attorney who had represented Sarah in the divorce. My first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity got the better of me. She said she was calling not as a lawyer, but as an intermediary. Sarah wanted to speak with me, not to ask for money, not to attempt reconciliation, but for something Linda called closure. My immediate answer was no. I had nothing to talk to Sarah about, but Linda insisted, saying Sarah was sick, that doctors had diagnosed an aggressive cancer, and that she wanted to make amends before it was too late. The news caught me off guard. Cancer. Sarah was dying. She was only 37. My reaction was mixed, a mixture of shock, something that could have been distant grief, and a question I didn't want to ask, but which arose involuntarily. Could the stress of everything that had happened have contributed to the disease? Dr. Marks had taught me that unproductive guilt was something to be avoided, that people make choices and live with the consequences, and that I wasn't responsible for Sarah's health. But the human mind is complicated, and that news stirred something inside me that I thought was completely dead. I told Linda I needed to think about it. She gave me a contact number and hung up. I spent the next 3 days internally conflicted about what to do. Jennifer sensed something was bothering me. When I finally told her about the connection, she didn't tell me what to do. She simply asked what I thought I needed to find complete peace. If I met Sarah, hearing what she had to say, would that be part of that process, or would it just reopen wounds? I wasn't sure. I spoke with Dr. Marcus in an emergency session. She said the choice was entirely mine, but that sometimes confronting the past one last time could be cathartic. That listening didn't mean forgiving, and that I could set clear boundaries about what I was willing to discuss. After much thought, I decided to accept, not for Sarah but for myself, to close that chapter definitively. The meeting was scheduled at a small, inconspicuous cafe in a part of Portland neither of us usually frequented. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner, with my back to the wall, overlooking the entrance. Old instincts of self-preservation. Sarah arrived punctually, and the shock of seeing her was visceral. She had easily lost 40 pounds. Her hair was thin and lifeless, and dark circles were deep under her eyes. She looked like she had aged 20 years. The chemotherapy treatments were clearly taking their toll. She sat across from me with the careful movements of someone in constant pain. We ordered coffee, neither of us touching the cups when they arrived. The silence between us was thick as concrete. Sarah spoke first. Her voice was weak, but her words were clear. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, that she didn't deserve forgiveness, but that she needed me to know a few things before she died. That the affair with Derek had begun not out of a lack of love for me, but out of a deep insecurity within herself. That Derek had haunted her, whispering that she deserved more, that I was neglecting her, that she was wasting the best years of her life on me. That at first she had resisted, but eventually the constant attention, the validation Derek offered, had broken down her defenses. That by the time she realized how far things had gone, it was too late to turn back. That stealing the money had been Derek's idea, that he'd convinced her I would never find out, that it was money they deserved to start a new life together. I listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished that part, I asked her directly about the pregnancy, about how she had planned to make me believe Emma was my daughter. Sarah began to cry, silent tears streaming down her thin face. She said it had been the worst decision ever, that she had stopped taking the pill, thinking that getting pregnant with Derek and making me believe he was mine would be the perfect way to ensure financial security, that she had never truly considered the emotional impact it would have on me, on the child, on everyone involved, that it had been pure selfishness disguised as love, that now, looking at Emma, a 3-year-old who would grow up without a mother, she understood the magnitude of what she had done, that she had condemned an innocent child to suffer the consequences of her selfish actions. I asked about Derek, what their relationship was like now. Sarah gave a bitter, humorless laugh. She said Derek had abandoned her 6 months after Emma was born, that the reality of being a father, of being broke, of having a criminal record had been too much for him. That he had fled to Seattle, was working a lousy job, barely paying the minimum child support the court had ordered, that she hadn't heard from him in over 2 years, that the great love that had made it all worth it had turned out to be nothing more than a fantasy, an illusion created by 2 broken people who thought they could build happiness on the destruction of others. That Derek had used her as much as he had used me, and when she was no longer useful, he simply disappeared. The irony was almost comical. Derek had destroyed everything out of envy. He had gotten the woman he thought he wanted, the money he thought he needed, the victory over me that he thought would make him happy. And in the end, it had all proved empty. He had lost everything, including his own identity and dignity, and had gained nothing of value in return. Sarah had lost a husband who genuinely loved her, a promising career, financial stability, and now she was losing her own life, leaving a young daughter motherless. And Emma, the innocent child in the middle of it all, would grow up knowing that her father was a coward who ran away, and her mother was a woman who died young after destroying multiple lives. There were no winners in that story, only varying degrees of loss. Sarah then said the thing that impacted me most. She said she envied me, Not the material things, not the career or the money, but the strength I had demonstrated, the ability to rebuild myself, to not let the betrayal define me, to emerge from that situation not only intact, but stronger. She said she had spent the last 3 years self-destructing, sinking into depression, hating herself, wishing she could go back in time and make different choices. That when the cancer diagnosis came, part of her had felt relief, because it meant the suffering would end. And then she looked me in the eye and said that the greatest punishment hadn't been the lawsuits, the loss of money, or the public humiliation. It had been having to live with herself, knowing what she had done to someone who had never been anything but kind to her. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction, a final validation that my revenge had been effective and deserved. But looking at that broken, dying woman before me, all I felt was exhaustion. Tired of carrying anger, of mentally revisiting betrayals, of allowing people who had hurt me to continue to occupy space in my mind. Sarah asked if there was any possibility of forgiveness, not for herself, but for Emma, so that her daughter wouldn't grow up knowing that her mother had died, bearing the weight of unforgivable sins. I thought carefully before answering. He said forgiveness was a complicated word, that I couldn't forgive the actions because they were unforgivable, but that I could let go of the anger, that I could acknowledge that she was a flawed person who had made terrible choices and was paying the ultimate price. I told Sarah I didn't wish her any more pain, that what had happened was punishment enough, that she should use her remaining time to be the best mother she could be to Emma, to prepare her for a life without her, to leave some positive legacy amidst all this destruction. Sarah thanked me, now crying openly. She said Emma was being raised by her parents, who were good people who loved their granddaughter unconditionally. That she had prepared letters for Emma to read when she was older, explaining not to justify, but to provide context. That she hoped Emma would grow up to be a better person than she had been. That was her only remaining wish. We finished our coffee without saying much more. When we got up to leave, Sarah hugged me. It was brief, and I hugged her stiffly back. She whispered thank you and left the cafe without looking back. I sat there for another 20 minutes, processing that conversation. I called Jennifer and told her everything. She asked how I was feeling. Honestly, I felt at peace in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not because I had completely forgiven, but because I had seen with my own eyes that justice, whether through legal courts or life's natural consequences, eventually reaches everyone. That Derek and Sarah had destroyed their own lives far more effectively than any revenge I could have planned. That in the end, all I had done was expose the truth and let reality take its course. And that, I realized, was enough. More than enough. Sarah died 6 weeks after that encounter. I learned about it through an obituary in the Portland paper. The funeral was small, just immediate family. I didn't go. It wouldn't have been appropriate. But I sent flowers anonymously, not to Sarah, but to Emma, a child who lost her mother because of the selfish choices of the adults around her. My mother attended the funeral, saying Sarah's parents were broken but determined to give Emma a good life. That there was no sign of Derek, that he apparently didn't even know Sarah had died, or if he did, he didn't care enough to show up. That told me everything I needed to know about who my brother really was, or rather, who he had become, an empty shell of a man, living a miserable existence somewhere, running from responsibilities, consumed by regrets. As for me, I was living the best version of my life. Jennifer and I were married in a small, intimate ceremony on the Oregon coast. Just close friends and my mother were present. It was simple, genuine, and filled with real joy, without the romantic illusions that had permeated my first marriage. We bought a new house together, in a different neighborhood, without any bad memories. My career continued to flourish. I had become one of Portland's most respected architects. Jennifer opened her own interior design firm and was thriving. We talked about having children, but without pressure, without artificial timelines. If it happened, it would happen. And if it didn't, our lives would be complete just the same. Because we learned that true happiness doesn't come from following a prescribed script, but from building something authentic with the right person. My relationship with my parents slowly improved. It would never return to what it was before. That innocence was gone forever. But we found a new normal: monthly dinners, weekly calls, attendance at important events. My father never fully forgave himself for what he did, and I never forgot. But we found a way to coexist that, if not warm, was at least respectful. He had become a quieter, more introspective man, carrying the weight of having lost a son to circumstances he helped create. As for Derek, I never had contact again. I learned from third parties that he eventually returned to Portland, was living in a tiny apartment, working temporary jobs, completely isolated from his family. I felt nothing when I heard this. No anger, no satisfaction, no pity, just indifference. He had become irrelevant in my life. Looking back today, I see that period of my life as a turning point, a moment that defined who I would become. I could have reacted with physical violence. I could have self-destructed with drugs or alcohol. I could have become bitter and unable to trust again. But I chose a different path. I chose to use the legal system, to expose the truth, to seek justice through appropriate means. Yes, it was brutal. Yes, it destroyed relationships and caused collateral pain. But it also taught me a resilience I didn't know I possessed. That I am capable of facing ultimate betrayal and still rebuilding myself. That I am not a victim, but a survivor. And that lesson, as painful as it was to learn, was worth it all. The story I began to tell at the beginning of this account doesn't have a happy ending in the traditional sense. Families were destroyed, lives were ruined, one person died too young. But it has a conclusion that offers something perhaps more valuable than superficial happiness: truth and justice. The truth about who people really are when no one is looking. The justice of appropriate consequences for unforgivable actions. And the realization that envy, that toxic emotion that consumed my brother and led him to make terrible choices, never pays. Derek envied everything I had. And in the process of trying to take what was mine, he destroyed everything that was his, and discovered that what he thought he wanted was just an empty illusion. To anyone watching this and experiencing a similar betrayal, my advice is this: don't let anger consume you, but also don't let the betrayal go unpunished. Expose the truth. Seek justice through legal and appropriate means. Protect your assets and your sanity. Yes, it will be painful. Yes, relationships will be damaged. But living a lie is worse, and allowing people who betrayed you to continue to benefit at your expense is unacceptable. You deserve better. You are stronger than you think. And on the other side of this pain, there is a life waiting for you. A better, more authentic life, built on truth rather than illusions. I found that life, and if I could do it, so can you. I finally showed my brother who he truly was. Not through violence or cruel revenge, but simply by removing the masks and letting everyone see the truth. And that truth was more devastating than anything I could have actively done, because in the end, Derek destroyed himself. I simply turned on the lights and made everyone look. And that, I discovered, is the most powerful revenge of all, allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own actions, unable to hide, unable to lie, unable to escape the reality of what they had done. Justice was served, and I was finally, truly free. If this story impacted you in any way, please like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments your own experiences with family betrayal or situations where you had to make difficult decisions to protect yourself. And remember, you are not defined by what is done to you, but by how you respond. Choose justice, choose truth, and choose yourself, always.